when is good news bad news? And when is bad news good news? Sometimes the line between bad news and good news can be pretty thin, I think. I'll give you an example. A couple of months ago, I got up in the morning and I went downstairs first thing to make my coffee, like I always do, and I stepped on the mat in front of my sink, and it was soaking wet, which seemed like bad news. So I checked the sink and under the sink, and there was no running water there. And I checked the dishwasher, and it didn't seem like it was wet anywhere. And so I walked around a little bit and discovered that my whole floor was squishy. And it was squishy all the way to the refrigerator. And as it turns out, there had been a tiny leak in the back of my refrigerator that had soaked the floorboards and my floor all the way from the fridge to the sink. This is bad news. But actually, it's really kind of good news because I hate the floor in my kitchen. I have hated the floor in my kitchen since I bought that house, and now I get to have a new floor, and the insurance company is going to pay for it because it was a flood. Yes. So that actually turned out to be pretty good news for me, but pretty terrible news for my insurance company. Good news or bad news often depends on what role you're playing in the story. In today's gospel story, Jesus is in his hometown, and he goes to the synagogue, as is his custom, and he reads from the prophet Isaiah, and he says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor, release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, freedom for the oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And as he sits down, he says to his friends and his family, "This scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. I am the one that you have been waiting for. I have been the one to come to bring good news." And this is good news. You know, the word gospel actually means good news. Gos means good in Old English, and spell means story or message. Good story, good message, good news. And when we hear this scripture, don't we think that? Don't we go, yes, that's the good news of the gospel. The good news of the gospel is that there is relief for the poor, and the captives are released and the oppressed are set free. This is good news. But while the gospel is a good story, the gospel is not a simple story. And what might be good news for the poor and the captive and the oppressed is likely very bad news for the wealthy and the powerful. It is a good story, but it is not a simple story. And for some, it is very good news, and for some, it is bad news. And I have to say that as I read and reflected on this passage this week, I think that this story is bad news for us. For we are the wealthy and the powerful. Do you know that in Silicon Valley, 25% of the people who live here are food insecure? 25% of our neighbors skip a meal every day. 25% of the people who are working, sometimes more than one job, are relying on food stamps or food banks to feed their families. Many of us go to work in a company and we walk into the cafeteria for lunch and they hand us our food for free or at a discounted cost. while the people preparing that food have to choose between paying their rent and feeding their children. This is very bad news for us. Do you know that the United States accounts for 5% of the world's population, but we have 21% of the world's prisoners? Our criminal justice system incarcerates black people at a rate of 5 times of that than white people. Our justice system uses fines and paroles to harass and berate poor people and minorities. And we'd be here all day if I got on a rant about what we do to the mentally ill in our justice system. And as I thought about this week, I realized that part of this is my fault. The last time I filled out a ballot and I voted for a judge, I didn't know anything about that judge. I don't know how that judge treats people in their courtroom. I don't know what the sentencing history of that judge is. I don't know anything about our attorney general or our district attorney. We are complicit in a system that captures and captivates people. This is very bad news for us. Last week we celebrated Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday. 50 years after Martin Luther King Jr. led a group of people across a bridge in Selma and marched to Montgomery to bring attention to voter suppression. Voter suppression is alive and well in our country. Racial and prejudicial violence happens all around us all the time, not just against our African American friends, but against Jews and Muslims and immigrants of all kinds. A young gay couple was walking down the street holding hands in Austin, Texas last week and were nearly beaten to death by 3 young men who walked upon them. Oppression, still with us. And like it or not, we're part of the system that lets that keep happening. This is very bad news for us. The good news is that the gospel is not a simple story. It is a good story, but it is not simple. And when Jesus promises release to the captives, Jesus promises that to us too. Where you see, we are held captive by our fear. We are bound in chains by our fear. We hoard wealth to ourselves because we are afraid of what will happen to us if we don't have enough. We allow ourselves to ignore what's happening in our prisons because we are afraid of those people, and we are afraid of what they might be and what they might do and how they might harm us. And so we just pretend like it's not there. Our fear keeps our voices silent in the midst of violence and oppression because of what might happen to us if we speak out. It is dangerous, dangerous work to topple the systems that we have in place that hold people captive and keep people poor and oppress people. If you read the rest of this gospel, you'll hear that the people of Jesus' town ran him out of town and tried to throw him off a cliff. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. But the gospel promises us that Jesus brings good news to us too, that we can be set free from the fear that holds us back. You know, the opposite of faith is not doubt. The opposite of faith is fear. And fear binds us. And fear keeps us from doing the good work of the gospel. And so this gospel that is good news to the poor and the captive and the oppressed, and bad news for the wealthy and the powerful, is also good news for all of us. Because when we bring relief to the poor, release to the captives, and freedom to the oppressed, we are all free. The scripture is fulfilled in our midst right then and right there. And that is very, very good news. Amen.